Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today my guest is Dr. Belén López-Pérez. She is a lecturer in psychology at Liverpool Hope University in the UK, where she also directs the ChildLab. She concluded her PhD in social psychology at Universidad Autonoma de Madrid in 2012 and her postdoctoral research in social and developmental psychology in the School of Psychology at Plymouth University. Her research interests include empathy and interpersonal emotion regulation across the lifespan, as well as happiness and well-being. Her current research projects are focused on interpersonal emotion regulation in childhood and developmental differences in emotion goals. So, Dr. López-Pérez, thank you a lot for taking the time to be on the show.
No, thank you, Ricardo, for inviting me today.
Okay, it's my pleasure. So let me first ask you, because today our conversation will be focused mostly on empathy and also emotion regulation and the developmental aspects behind them. So when we talk about empathy, what are we really talking about? Because I guess that perhaps scientists do not approach empathy exactly the same way as common people do.
Yes.
So what is really empathy about?
Yes. Yeah, so Ricardo, you're completely right. For lay people, if we ask what empathy is, they would define it as putting themselves in the other people's shoes. But actually, this is just one element of empathy. So we have to understand empathy. It is a multi-dimensional construct. This is agreed since the 80s, thanks to the work of Mark Davis. And basically, the scientific community agrees that it has a cognitive component and an affective component. So within the cognitive component, we would have perspective taking, which is basically, it depends on the researchers, because some people would say, well, it's the capacity to understand how other people feel, but some have been a little bit more fine-grained, and they have made a distinction between thinking oneself or imagining oneself in the other situation, which would be self-perspective taking, or thinking and imagining how the other person feels, which would be other perspective taking. Okay, so this would be the cognitive dimension. And then we would have the affective dimension, which is basically the capacity to experience an emotional reaction that is congruent or coherent to the emotional situation the other person is.
Okay, so empathy is not an unitary phenomenon, right? It's not a single thing. It is multi-layered and has several different dimensions. As you said, it has cognitive components, emotional components, and I guess that even sometimes separating what we call cognition from emotion, it's not really perhaps the best approach to it, because even emotions, they work also sort as cognitive tools, in the sense that they allow for us to know something about how to approach the world and particularly social situations, correct?
Yes, the problem with the study of empathy, and if you start doing a literature review, this is the first problem that comes up, is that different researchers use different terms to label the same phenomena. So for instance, the emotional reaction, some people would call it compassion, some people would call it sympathy, some people would call it empathic concern. So this creates, a whole chaos in the study of empathy. I agree with you that sometimes it is really difficult to separate. And when we have done so, it has been following an experimental approach to better understand how the cognitive element may impact on the affective element. But for instance, we know from clinical research that, for instance, people who score high on psychopathy, or that would be classified as psychopaths, they score quite high in the cognitive component. So for instance, they can understand how the other person feels, but they score really, really low in the affective component. So they cannot feel a congruent emotion for the other person. which actually, you know, leads them to engage in a criminal offense. So I think that from a scientific perspective, it's important to separate both, but I agree with you that in real life, they're really interrelated, and it would be difficult to actually separate the dimensions.
Mm-hmm. And that's interesting because I'm not sure if you can say anything specifically about this, but Paul Bloom, in his work and in his book, specifically Against Empathy, he talks about on the one hand cognitive empathy and on the other hand emotional empathy. But I mean, he separates the two things, and I'm not sure if there's any research perhaps establishing different brain circuits or pathways that really allow for us to separate those two dimensions of empathy or not. But in a normal functioning person, is it really possible to really just express or manifest cognitive empathy towards someone or a situation and leaving aside the emotional aspects of it?
So we would, I mean, the idea is that ideally, okay, in the ideal world, I mean, well, first, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I don't want to get involved in labeling any specific brain areas. Also because, I mean, there are many different studies, different manipulations, they identify different specific aspects within the brain. So since it is not my area of expertise, I prefer not to talk about neuroscience, but in regards to whether we can find this separation in a lay individual, this is what we should ideally find in those professionals that deal with other people's suffering. So, for instance, basically people who work with others on a daily basis, teachers, medical professionals, nursing professionals, psychologists. So their cognitive component needs to be working in the sense that they need to understand, for instance, a nursing professional, they need to understand how the patient is feeling. But we know from many different studies that if actually they engage in this emotional response, they're quite likely to end up exhibiting burnout, which we know that this will lead to maybe quitting their job because of emotional exhaustion. So, and I think that these are the best examples I can provide, that it is possible that we can understand, but we may not necessarily feel how the other person is feeling. And I think that these mechanisms are put in place just to avoid feeling emotionally exhausted.
Mm-hmm. And what is the relationship between empathy and emotion regulation? And by the way, could you explain what emotion regulation is about? Because I mean, perhaps we can approach it in different ways, and when people hear the term emotion regulation, they might think that it is about us being able to control our emotions, but also perhaps be able to express the correct emotions in the correct circumstances and things like that. So what is it really about?
Okay, so well, the emotion regulation process is complex in the sense that there are the different processes in order to control, manage, and express the emotional response. Now, we have to make a distinction between intrapersonal, which is what I do with my own emotions, and interpersonal, which is what I do with other people's emotions, okay? Traditionally, research has focused on what we do with our own emotions. Okay, what is the relationship with empathy? Basically, well, it depends on the authors, of course. If we rely, for instance, on the model of emotional intelligence, the classical model by Salovey and Meyer, they would say that there are different dimensions, okay? Because they talk about emotion attention, emotion understanding, where they would place empathy, and emotion management, where they would place emotion regulation, right? So, according to this model, there are two separate phenomena that, of course, are interrelated in the sense that people who score high on empathy should be better at changing the emotions. Now, if we take, for instance, other papers by Taki, for instance, and Williams, 2013, they would say, for instance, they would say that empathy is a form of interpersonal emotion regulation, which I personally don't agree with. I think that I would best support the approach by Salovey Meyer, or for instance, developmental psychologists such as Dunfield, or even Martin Hoffman, who said, basically we need to understand other people's emotions, which would be like the necessary antecedent in order for engaging in this process of altering or changing or being capable of expressing the right emotion in the right situation. So what is the relationship? I think that empathy is the antecedent and emotion regulation would happen afterwards. If we think about it in terms of intrapersonal, okay, because I have described it in terms of interpersonal, we know that empathy is linked to emotion understanding. So basically, if I'm capable of understanding how the others are feeling, it is more likely that I will be able to understand how I feel. And therefore, I will be capable of suppressing or controlling an emotional response that it may not be appropriate for the context, and change it into the right one.
Mm-hmm. And what are perhaps some of the main developmental aspects of emotion regulation and empathy? I mean, is there do we have some well-established stages, developmental stages that children go through if they are functioning normally and developing in a normal way? Do we have that for emotion regulation and empathy, like we have for some cognitive aspects of development, or not?
Yes, so, well, for emotion regulation, there's still lots of work to do. That's why, my current research is focused on that. In regards to empathy, I mean, Nancy Eisenberg has devoted most of her career to investigate that, the same Martin Hoffman. And basically, we know that, for instance, for empathy, since children are born up to 1 year of age, they exhibit what it's called global empathy, or it has also been labeled reactive crying. So if we take a newborn and we place them next to another newborn who is crying, the baby will start crying. So they will mimic the crying of the other baby. So it is like a kind of mimicry response. We know that basically up to the age of 3, they exhibit what is called egocentric empathy, in the sense that they may feel upset if they see another child who is also feeling upset, but not because they really care about the other, it's because maybe that emotional response may bother them. And it is not until early childhood, well, a little bit later on that early childhood, let's say 6-7 years of age, that children actually start engaging in this perspective taking, okay? So they start thinking, okay, this is the emotional situation, this is how the other person feels. Why at that specific age? Because we also have to think in terms of the development of all the cognitive capacities. For instance, theory of mind, which is the capacity we have to understand other people's intentions, beliefs, and emotions. And we know that this is mastered by children at the age of 4 or 5 years of age. So it is not until that moment when children can start thinking about how the other feels in different situations. Now, in regards to emotion regulation, I mean, most of the studies have focused on frustration, and for instance, the marshmallow experiment, just to see, if children could suppress the desire of taking the marshmallow because they're gonna receive 2 if they wait for it, right? And it is not until recently where researchers have looked at what are the differences in the use of strategies. So we conducted a study comparing 3 and 4 year olds, 5 and 6 year olds, and 7 and 8 year olds. I mean, we focused on both intrapersonal and interpersonal, and basically what we found is that behavioral strategies, so for instance, if I see another child who is upset or I'm upset as well, I may use distraction. Why it is more prevalent in young children? Because actually it's a strategy that is mainly used by parents. So think about the situation where a child is going to be vaccinated. It is a painful event. So what do parents do? They tend to distract the child, so that the child doesn't pay attention in the needle, right? So they learn this from a very early age. So it is not surprising that it's more prevalent in younger children. However, cognitive strategies that may involve thinking about the situation, analyzing other alternatives about the situation, it are mainly used by older children, so 7 and 8-year-olds onwards, because it is far more complex. So again, it is not surprising, but basically previous research had overlooked this aspect.
Okay, so is it the case that even before perhaps children develop a full-fledged theory of mind around 4 or 5 years of age, as you said, and also perspective taking, that if they see someone that exhibits signs of distress, that perhaps they try to help that person and they show that they are somewhat concerned with what is happening to them?
Yes, so they will not mainly, we observe in our studies that, for instance, children at that age, some of them were capable of using cognitive strategies, but it's not going to be the majority. So we have to describe the strategies that they use. They may rely on affect display, such as providing hugs, kisses to the parents, carers, or closest members of the family. They may use humor, which we found that it was equally used by all age groups. Or they will use distraction strategies. So they will either try to divert the conversation or try, for instance, to give them their favorite toy or something that they know that the carer really, really like to change how they're feeling.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what is the relationship here between emotion regulation and happiness and well-being? Because I would imagine that someone who is not really able or not properly able to control their emotions and to express them properly in the right situations and contexts, that person would be miserable, let's say.
Yes, so the study of emotion regulation first focus on the strategies, right? So what processes people put in place to change either their own emotions or the emotions of others. So we know that some strategies are more adaptive than others. So for instance, cognitive reappraisal, or being capable of looking at the situation from a positive light, is linked to higher well-being. Okay, whereas other strategies such as suppression or keeping the emotional response to oneself are linked to lower well-being, but not only from a psychological point of view. It has also been found, let's say, a biological correlate, in the sense that higher suppression is linked to higher cardiovascular diseases, for example. So this is just from the strategy use point of view. Now, more recently, some researchers such as Maya Tamir have proposed the concept of emotion goals, or in other words, what emotions people want to feel in different contexts, okay, which actually links to the other component that you were mentioning. And we know that people who, for instance, value excessively happiness or want to feel happy all the time, it's linked to lower well-being, contrary to what people may thought. Because why is that? Research traditionally has supported this hedonic perspective. We have to feel good all the time, and only in few occasions, people may feel bad, and feeling bad is linked to feeling miserable, as you were saying. However, there are goals and there are contexts in which we actually have to feel bad. So imagine we're in a place and the fire alarm goes on. If we don't feel fear in that situation, we're not going to escape. Okay, and if we're actually feeling happy, laughing, we may not escape from the fire. Or imagine if someone cheated at you. If you're happy, you may not be able to confront that person. So that's why a higher or extreme preference for happiness is linked to lower well-being. In the same sense that, for instance, it has been found that wanting to feel the right emotion for the right context, so for example, happiness for collaborating with other people or anger for confrontation, has been linked to higher well-being as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and isn't it also the case that negative emotion might also play an important role in motivating us to do certain things that are important to us, even though perhaps we don't really want to do them? Like, for example, if I'm not doing anything with my life and if I feel good about it, perhaps I will keep on in that situation. But if I feel bad with myself, perhaps I have the motivation to try to really pick me up and go and do something. So.
Exactly. I mean, this links to the classical theory of motivation, in which, we set up higher goals. The idea is that, as you said, if I'm not doing anything with my life, and I'm actually quite happy with it, I don't feel any kind of discrepancy. Okay, so I'm not going to do anything to change it because I'm happy as I am. However, if I realize that I'm not meeting my life goals, I may feel miserable. But this feeling of unhappiness may motivate me to get closer my current self to my ideal self. So sometimes we need to feel bad in order to be motivated to do things.
Mm-hmm. So earlier you referred to the fact that perhaps focusing too much on happiness and on feeling good all the time might have some negative effect. So do you think that perhaps a culture that we have nowadays, at least in the West, where the focus is really on people's happiness and being happy all the time and feeling good with oneself all the time, that perhaps it might be contributing to people really being put in bad emotional situations because, of course, no one is able to feel good all the time, and if they are not able to reach that ideal, then they really get even lower in their sort of experiencing negative emotions and things like that.
Yes, I mean, exactly. You have defined it perfectly. I mean, we're living in an hedonic world where people have to feel good all the time. And for instance, through social media, this is, this is what it's sold to people. A supposedly perfect life, perfect physical appearance, people who have access to expensive items. It is kind of like the depiction of the ideal self, especially, for instance, in platforms such as Instagram. And I think that this can have really, really detrimental effects. I mean, if we think in terms of the statistics, we know that mental health problems are becoming more and more prevalent worldwide. And I think that it is due to the fact that people aim to strive for this ideal life. And as you said, it is not possible to have such ideal life. I think that people need to accept more that things are not perfect. And we cannot be in control of everything because we cannot control everything in our lives. We depend on many different factors and many different situations and many different people. So I think that in the moment that people may accept that and may understand that sometimes one needs to feel bad in order to feel better later on, potentially, this could have a decrease in the amount of mental health conditions, especially, I mean, in depression and anxiety, which are clearly linked to this misperception of how life should be.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I mean, it's very easy for me to imagine that if people are constantly bombarded by things in social media and even mainstream media about them having to be happy all the time and feeling good about themselves all the time, that perhaps if they don't feel bad, even if it's only now and then, perhaps they think that they're failing somehow to attain a certain ideal. And even in their social lives, perhaps if people just want to be all the time surrounded by joyful people, perhaps if someone feels bad, they might even alienate that person in some way or another, right?
Yes, I think that, I mean, people should be really cautious about what they see in social media, in the sense that it is not the reality, because the reality is that, you know, things are not always perfect. And I think that because, you know, there's now this new trend from positive psychology, which I mean, I truly support. That's why I also do research on well-being, don't take me wrong, but I think that they put a huge emphasis on positive emotions and feeling positive and expressing gratitude, which I think it is necessary, but I think that there should be also a component of accepting negative emotions, because I think that sometimes people may feel negative, and, you know, instead of saying, okay, that is normal, that it's completely fine, this situation happened and it's normal that I feel bad, they, you know, they may engage in other processes, such as feeling guilty or feeling extremely bad, because, you know, we have this feeling that we need to be happy all the time, no matter what.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of emotion regulation, is it the case that perhaps the degree of emotion regulation and perhaps also the types of emotions that people want to express in different contexts, does it vary according to the personality traits that the person has? I mean, perhaps there are people that don't really care that much, that they are not able to acquire a high degree of emotion regulation, and some people perhaps feel better if they express more negative emotion instead of positive emotions and things like that. I mean, do we know anything about that?
Well, as far as I'm aware, there are no studies focusing on personality traits. Now, there are some studies linking these emotion goals or these emotion preferences, depending on the context, with, for instance, attitudes towards emotions. So we know that, for instance, people who hold negative attitudes towards negative emotions, or in other words, they think that negative emotions are always harmful, okay, may have a lower preference for those emotions, even if those emotions might be the right emotions to feel for those contexts. So, for instance, fear for avoidance or anger for confrontation, which we know already from the evidence we discussed before, that these are the right emotions to feel in order to exhibit higher well-being. So attitudes towards emotions play a huge role. There are also cultural differences in the sense that, I mean, in terms of expression, for instance, there are cultures. I mean, we have the individualism, collectivism dimension, and we know that, for instance, you know, highly collectivistic cultures may not be able to express certain emotions or may not have a preference for certain emotions if this would impair or if this would damage somehow the group. Or, for instance, you know, also the style of communication. For instance, here in the UK, the style of communication, it is really indirect, in the sense that people may not express very openly their emotions because they may feel that this may hurt other people. So this, of course, is going to have an impact in the type of emotions that people prefer to feel. If you ask here, people have a preference for happiness, because if they feel that actually having a preference for anger may lead to this higher expression of anger, which would not be positively perceived by the others.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about empathy and empathic concern in this case. What is the relationship between empathic concern and personal distress? I mean, is there a certain level or threshold beyond which, if someone is exposed to another person that is in distress, that they feel so bad to be next to that person or to be in direct contact with her that they just want to get away and they don't want to help her anymore or something like that?
Yes. So, okay. So, well, okay, there's a little bit of a misunderstanding in the sense that some people would argue, for instance, the video argued that personal distress was the extreme form of empathic concern. However, I think that it is already well established since the 80s by Daniel Batson, okay, who is a really famous social psychologist, that empathic concern and personal distress are qualitatively different emotions, and I will explain myself. So according to actually the model of empathy altruism by Batson, the first thing that happens is we perceive a need in the other. So we perceive that the other may be experiencing a certain difficulty, okay? So it could happen two things. You could think about how the other person feels, or in other words, other perspective taking, which may lead to experiencing empathic concern. So, okay, I start thinking how the other feels, and therefore I experience empathic concern, or in other words, feelings of sympathy, compassion, tenderness for the other person, okay? In the same situation, okay, it could happen that I perceive the need, but instead of thinking about the other, I start imagining myself in the other situation, which is called self-perspective taking. This more likely trigger this personal distress or feelings of worry, anxiety, and irritation because of what's happening to the other. Now, in terms of what happens, in terms of behavior, we know that potentially both of them trigger helping behavior, okay? So potentially one person experiencing empathic concern and the other one experiencing personal distress may go and help the victim. Now, further experimental studies found that basically the motivation linked to this helping is completely different. So if I feel empathic concern, my motivation to help the other would be altruistic, or in other words, I help the other because my final goal is to ensure that this person is completely fine. So I really care about the other person. However, if I experience personal distress, I help the other for egoistic reasons. That is, I help him or her because I can either stop the suffering, which is really bothering me, or I can get some kind of reward, for instance, social recognition by the others. Now, further experimental research found that if we place these two people in a situation when it is easy to escape from it, so basically, just to go away, those who exhibit empathic concern will still be there. So we'll continue helping regardless of whether it's easy or not to escape from the situation. However, those who experience personal distress will go away more likely because they do not really care about the other, they really care about their own suffering. So it is true that, for instance, situations in which we could define as highly emotional intense, so for instance, huge emergencies, are more likely to trigger personal distress than empathic concern. But there are many, many variables that may affect that specific emotional response.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps relating to that, could you tell us about the one among others effect and perhaps how it affects also empathic concern?
Yes, so basically, okay, so this was a phenomena basically proposed by my colleague, Dr. Luis Oceja, who works at Universidad Autonoma de Madrid. And he realized that basically the way we present the victim may play a huge role in helping behavior, okay? So, okay, basically what he did is he presented the same need situation. So it was he presented the case of a victim. Now there were two different experimental conditions. The victim could be presented on her own, or the victim could be presented as one among other victims, okay? So it was one girl or one girl among other girls who had the same type of need, okay? And what he realized is that helping behavior decreased when you presented one victim among other victims. Why? Because people felt that it was unfair to helping just one person in that situation when there were other potential targets exhibiting the same need. So even if people felt empathy for that girl, they said, they prefer not to engage in helping behavior because they found that it would be unfair for the other people, which actually I think that this is a really interesting effect, especially for NGOs who are always searching for people, you know, to donate or to engage in pro-social behavior. So I think that it has really important implications.
Mm-hmm. Yet, and yes, and it is somehow related to perhaps the bystander effect. I mean, in that case, it is several different victims that people are trying to help. In the bystander effect, it is several different people around the same victim that fail to help her just because they expect others to
do it. Exactly. Yes, but I mean, yeah, kind of similar but different, as you said, because the bystander effect is like, I don't help you because I expect someone else to do it. And here is like, it's more about a feeling of unfairness. Okay, if I help her, I'm just helping one, but what about the other people who are in the same situation? And this prevents people to engage, you know, in a, for instance, in a monetary donation or in helping behavior itself.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so now let's move on to perhaps the most controversial part of your work, that is the relationship between empathy and cruelty. And I will also be leaving a link in the description box to a very interesting piece that you wrote to Ian titled Cruel to be Kind.
Yeah.
So could you tell us first about the kind of experimental research that you've done and prepared in order to establish this sort of relationship between empathy and cruelty?
Okay, so basically, I mean, the idea came from, some studies not necessarily related to what I did, but for instance, you know, we know that in economic game theory, when we present people with basically a situation in which one person has a certain number of resources and they need to distribute those resources between themselves and other people, if they see an unfair situation, for instance, in which the person keeps all the resources and doesn't give anything to the other person, people actually engage in punishment for the perpetrator, even if punishing involves losing some of the coins or some of the points they were assigned. So you know, when we experience empathy, we're capable of engaging in these actions to punish perpetrators, right? So basically, I mean, at the same time, I was familiarized with the work of Tamir and colleagues, in which they say, well, sometimes we can make people feel bad if we can reap benefits from it. So basically, we can make people feel bad for an egoistic motivation. And I actually wanted to challenge that and show that sometimes, you know, we can make people feel bad for an altruistic reason, or in the sense that we can make others feel bad if we think that this will help them in the long term. So for instance, you know, going back to the example you mentioned before, if, you know, we see someone who is not doing anything with their life, and, you know, we feel that, okay, this person needs to do something in order, you know, to get a certain goal. So imagine a situation in which your younger sibling should be revising for a very important exam. Imagine that is an access exam to the university and your younger sibling is not revising at all. You may try to persuade him or her, you know, at the very beginning, but if you see that the situation doesn't change, maybe, you know, you decide to be harsher and be like, look, you either start studying or move on, or you're gonna be a completely failure. I know it sounds really harsh, but sometimes, you know, we need to talk people in this way to make them feel bad, so that, you know, we create this discrepancy in which their current self and the ideal self. So what we did in the lab, basically, there were many different experimental manipulations, but just to simplify, participants were told that they would play a video game and that they would be paired with another participant, and that they will have to, one will have to take decisions for the other. So, as a cover story, we said to them that they arrive before the other participants, so they will have the opportunity to choose their role randomly, okay, by selecting different cards that we have. So everybody was allocated to the role of player B, which meant that the supposedly other player that didn't exist, of course, would have to write a communication about themselves so that they could get to know a little bit better the other person they would be playing, and that they would be making decisions on their behalf. So they all received the same experimental manipulation, which was this, well, it was handprinted by us, but it was taken by Daniel Batson's research, in which the person described basically as a romantic split up situation, saying that they felt really, really upset, they felt really down, and they feel that they were not going to be able to recover from the situation quickly. So we reported the other person as heartbroken, basically, to provoke some kind of empathy in our participants. At the same time, we manipulated perspective taking. So half of the participants were asked to remain objective while reading this note, and the other ones were asked to basically understand how the other person was feeling, so other-oriented perspective taking. So after that, participants played a video game, which was our second independent variable. So there were two different types of games. One that was confrontational. So basically the main goal was to shoot as many people as possible, okay, based on the work by Tamir and colleagues. And the other half played a video game in which the goal was avoidance. So they have to escape, okay, from different rooms in order not to be killed by zombies. Why this experimental manipulation? Because as I mentioned before, confrontation is linked, or according to research, should be linked to be successful to the emotion of anger. Avoidance to be successful should be linked to the emotion of fear. So after playing the game, we said that basically was kind of a competition with the other player, okay? So we said, but now that you have played the game, of course they played the game without no music, no anything, we gave them different tasks to do. One of the tasks was to select the kind of music clips they wanted the other participant to listen to while playing the game. So there were anger-inducing, fear-inducing, and neutral music clips. But they didn't know what music clips induce what emotion. So we just asked them to listen to those music clips and just indicate which music they wanted the other person to listen to. We also provided them with different game descriptions. Again, descriptions linked to anger-inducing, fear-inducing, or neutral, and they have to indicate what kind of game description they wanted the other person to receive. And later on, just to ensure that we actually have an explicit measure, we asked them, how do you want the other person to feel while playing the game, okay? And the thing is, if they chose options that would provoke higher anger in the confrontation or higher fear in the avoidance game, they were lowering their chances of earning £50. Okay, so you actually have to be kind of altruistic, because you know it's £50 is not a lot, but I mean it's a nice price. So what we found is that basically those participants in the other-oriented perspective taking engage more in this altruistic, cruel to be kind approach, in the sense that they wanted the other person to feel more anger in the confrontation or more fear in the avoidance, as compared to the ones who were asked to remain objective. So basically we argue that it is altruistic because they actually were lowering their chances of earning the prize.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so could you just perhaps summarize in terms of the conclusions, what are the sorts of conditions where really people resort to cruelty or affect-worsening to try perhaps to motivate another person to do the right thing, let's say?
Yes, I think that it is really important to be really precise on the conditions, because I mean it seems like, okay, you need to be cruel for the sake of being cruel, and it's not like that. First, the negative emotion that we decide to induce in the other needs to be appropriate for the goal to achieve. So for instance, If we think about the situation in which our younger sibling is not revising for the exam, in that situation, the right emotion to induce would be a little bit of anxiety, because we know that anxiety, I mean, to a certain level, of course, may improve our performance, okay? Or going back to our experimental procedures, it was not random, the kind of emotion they chose. Those in the confrontation condition chose higher anger-inducing stimuli, and they indicated a higher preference for anger, and the same for avoidance, but with fear. So the first condition is that it's not any negative emotion. It has to be the right negative emotion for the goal we want to achieve. This is condition number one. Condition number two is would derive from number one, is that we need to put, we need to imagine how the other, we need to think about the other person. We need to imagine how the other person feels in that specific situation. Because according to what we found in our research, if you feel objective about the other, you're not going to do anything. You really need to understand how the other might be feeling in order to say, okay, this is what I have to do so that the person can move from point A to point B in terms of emotions. And the third thing is that it needs to be altruistic, in the sense that I should not be able to reap any benefit from my action. So if I do it because I care about the other, not because I'm going to get any kind of benefit from it. I mean, this would be maybe argued by many different researchers, because it is true that pure altruism is debatable. There are always, some potential indirect benefits you may get from it. But in principle, your main motivation should be altruistic. So, okay, I'm gonna make the other person feel bad because I want them to achieve this goal, but it's because, it is important for them. It is not because I'm gonna get anything out of it. Mm-hmm. So this would be basically the three conditions that we would need.
Right. And does it matter in terms of people deploying this affect-worsening strategy if the target is someone that they know, like a family member or a friend or a stranger? I mean, does it vary in terms of people deploying this strategy more or less according to the target?
Okay, so this is something that we haven't investigated yet, but in our experimental studies, people were completely strangers, okay? And despite of that, it happened because, we created this bond, we created this connection by providing this description. Now, I think that according to previous research, for instance, in empathy, it is true that the closer relationship we have with someone, the easier it is that we will be capable of identifying what goals the other person wants to achieve. And therefore, it will be more likely that this effect may take place, of course, but it is something that we still need to investigate.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I've also asked you that because I would imagine that people would use it more if it were directed at someone they really care about and they want to motivate to do the right thing or to do something with their lives and things like that.
Yes, but what it is undeniable from all the evidence of research is that we can feel empathy for strangers. That's why I think that we managed to find the effect also with strangers. But it is true that the closer bond we have with someone, the easier it will be that we can experience this empathy, and therefore that we can engage in this interpersonal affect worsening or this cruel to be kind. I envision that this potentially may happen, for instance, from parents to children, and also in romantic relationships. I think that these are the two venues that I think that we should focus in future studies.
Okay, so just one last question. Of course, this sort of strategy of affect worsening must have some limitations, because I mean, it is not for us to expect that it doesn't matter the amount of negative emotion that we cause in the other person. I mean, there must be a limit there, otherwise we're just being purely cruel and causing bad emotion, and we can even have the opposite effect of what we want to have on that person, right?
Yes, I mean, you have pointed something that I think it is really important. And this is something that we wonder ourselves, and that we should answer with future studies as well. Where is the limit in affect worsening? And I think that one of the factors that may explain where this limit lies is what is the goal the other person wants to achieve. I will try to explain myself. Let's go and imagine now a situation in which a parent realizes that their child is not pulling their weight at school. Okay, so going back to the example of achievement, the parent may try to be cruel, making the child feel bad. But the thing is, if the child doesn't have as a goal to have higher or excellent academic achievement, even if parents try to engage in this altruistic affect worsening, it's not going to work. And I think that it will turn to a situation where it will be cruelty for the sake of cruelty. So I think that actually, if I would have to choose one important factor to say, where could be the limit, I think that the limit lies in the point to, okay, is the goal that I think that the other person should be achieving the same goal that the person wants to achieve? Because the thing is, if there's a discrepancy, it's not going to work. And we're going to be cruel for the sake of cruelty. So this would be one thing. Another thing is the intensity of the emotional response we're trying to induce in the other person. Because I think that if it is too highly intense, or we don't explain properly why we're doing that, I think that potentially may provoke the opposite effect. I think that it will provoke reactance in the other person rather than motivate them to accomplish the goal.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. López-Pérez, I think that we've already gone through the main lines of your research, right? So just before we go, would you like to tell people, apart of course from your piece on AN and that I will leave in the description box, what are perhaps some of the best places on the internet for people to follow your work? And I don't know if you also want to leave any final remarks about it or not.
Okay, well, if they want to find, the work that I have been doing, they can find me in Google Scholar. Over there they can find many of my papers. I'm really interested in everything related to emotion regulation. That's why I'm also, I have a collaboration with people from computer science. We have developed a video game in which we try to train children's interpersonal emotion regulation. At the moment, we're undertaking some changes, so it's not available, but it's www.emodiscovery.com, and it's available in English, Spanish, and Polish. I think that this reflects kind of the brand new research that I'm conducting, and I think that people may find it interesting.
Okay, so thank you again for taking the time to be here with us today, and it was really a very interesting conversation.
No, thank you, Ricardo, for inviting me. Thank you very much.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Otherwise, if you don't like Patreon, you can also go to PayPal or Subscribestar. All of the links are in the description box of the video and also on my channel. And apart from that, you can also, of course, leave a like, share the interview, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Ló Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condriano, and my first producer, Isar Webe. Thank you for all.